The automatic doors slide open as Margaret Johnson, a kind-hearted 76-year-old black woman, steps into the local grocery store. The cool air greets her, offering relief from the summer heat. Dressed in a simple cardigan and comfortable sneakers, she clutches her neatly organized shopping list and her small black purse, the same one she's had for years. She knows exactly what she needs: fresh vegetables, a loaf of bread, and the store's weekly discount on tea. At checkout, Margaret pulls out a coupon she had carefully cut from the newspaper. She places it on the counter with a warm smile, expecting the usual scan and beep. Instead, the young cashier, a woman in her mid-20s with a skeptical glare, picks up the coupon and frowns. "This doesn't look right," the cashier mutters, flipping the paper back and forth. Margaret tilts her head. "Oh dear, I just got that from the store's flyer yesterday." "It should work," the cashier scoffs. "People try to pull scams like this all the time." Margaret's eyes widen. Scam? She had been shopping at this store for years, and never once had she been accused of anything. Other customers nearby glance over, sensing tension. Before Margaret can respond, a deep, commanding voice cuts through the air. "What's the problem here?" Officer Grant, a tall, broad-shouldered police officer, steps forward, his hand already resting on his holster. His uniform is crisp, his presence intimidating. He had been standing near the security counter watching the exchange unfold. The cashier immediately points at Margaret. She's trying to use a fake coupon. Margaret takes a step back, startled by how quickly things are escalating. "I would never do such a thing," she says, her voice trembling slightly. Grant narrows his eyes, looking Margaret up and down. "Empty your bag." Margaret blinks. "Excuse me." "I said, empty your bag," Grant repeats, stepping closer. Margaret clutches her purse tightly, humiliated by the demand. Customers whisper among themselves, some pulling out their phones. "I haven't done anything wrong," she says firmly. Grant's patience snaps. Without warning, he shoves her aside. Gasps fill the store as Margaret stumbles, nearly losing her balance. She grips the checkout counter to keep from falling. A young woman in the line instinctively reaches for her phone, hitting record. The air in the store is thick with tension. Customers stop what they are doing, frozen in disbelief. Margaret steadies herself, staring at Officer Grant with a mixture of shock and hurt. "Why are you treating me like this?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Grant doesn't answer. He simply glares down at her, convinced he holds all the power in the situation. How far will Officer Grant go? Margaret takes a shaky breath, clutching her purse tightly. "Officer, please," she says, her voice still gentle but firm. "I've done nothing wrong. I just want to go home." Her words do nothing to calm Grant down. His eyes narrow, his stance aggressive. "You're resisting," he snaps. Margaret shakes her head. "No, I'm just—" Before she can finish, Grant grabs her arm roughly. A sharp gasp escapes her lips as his fingers dig into her fragile skin. Her old bones ache under the pressure, but he doesn't care. "Stop resisting," Grant growls, tightening his grip. Margaret flinches, instinctively pulling back, but not out of defiance, out of fear. The store is dead silent now, except for the muffled beeps of a checkout scanner somewhere in the distance. Customers freeze in place, their eyes darting between the elderly woman and the officer. Then, it happens. Without warning, Officer Grant pulls back his fist and strikes her. The force of the punch to her shoulder sends Margaret stumbling backward. Her knees buckle. Her small frame crashes to the cold tile floor. A collective scream echoes through the store. "Oh my God!" someone yells. A shopping cart rattles as a woman jumps back in shock. Another customer rushes forward, dropping their groceries. A young boy clutches his mother's arm, eyes wide with terror. Margaret winces, her face twisted in pain, struggling to push herself up. Her hand trembles against the floor. Grant steps back, his chest rising and falling heavily, as if he just realized what he did. The tension in the store is unbearable. Then a loud voice shouts from across the room, "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Will anyone step in to help her? For a moment, the store is frozen in silence. Then chaos erupts. A young woman near the produce aisle pulls out her phone, her hands shaking as she hits record. "Oh my God," she mutters. "Did he just—" A middle-aged man with a shopping basket takes a step forward, glaring at Officer Grant. "What the hell is wrong with you?" The store manager, a nervous-looking man in a red vest, rushes forward. "Officer, that's enough," he says, his voice unsteady. Grant's face is red with frustration, his jaw clenched. "She was resisting," he snaps. The manager shakes his head. "No, she wasn't. We have cameras. Everyone saw what happened." Margaret groans softly, her fragile hands pressing against the cold tile as she struggles to sit up. Her vision is blurry. She feels the bruising already forming on her shoulder. A kind-faced woman kneels beside her, gently placing a hand on Margaret's back. "Take it slow, sweetie," she whispers. Another shopper, a man in a business suit, steps forward and reaches down. He offers his arm, his voice low but firm. "We saw everything. We've got you." Margaret looks around, her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. Why did this happen? She takes a shaky breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Her fingers tighten around the stranger's hand as he helps her to her feet. Grant takes a step back, his eyes darting around the room. The weight of what he's done sinks in, but his pride won't let him admit it. The young woman with the phone turns to Margaret. "Ma'am," she says softly, "are you going to press charges?" Margaret meets Grant's gaze, her eyes filled with something unexpected. Not just pain, but strength. Will Margaret press charges? The young woman with the phone recording steps closer to Margaret, concern written all over her face. She holds up her phone. "Do you want me to send this to someone?" she asks gently. Margaret inhales shakily, her body aching but her voice steady. She nods weakly. "Call my son." The young woman's brows furrow. "Your son?" Margaret slowly lifts a trembling hand, pulling a small slip of paper from her purse. A number is scrawled across it in neat, bold writing. She hands it over. "Tell him what happened," she says, her voice quiet yet firm. The woman quickly dials the number, placing the phone to her ear. The store remains eerily silent. People are still staring at Officer Grant, who now looks nervous, his once arrogant stance starting to shift. The phone rings once, twice. Then a deep voice answers. "Who is this?" The young woman glances at Margaret. Margaret closes her eyes for a moment, takes a breath, and then speaks. "It's me, baby. I need your help." Silence. Then the voice on the other end goes cold, dangerously cold. "Where are you?" the man demands, his tone sharper than a knife. Margaret swallows hard, gripping the phone tighter. "At the grocery store. A cop just—" She doesn't even finish her sentence before the voice interrupts. "I'm on my way." The line goes dead. Margaret slowly hands the phone back, her gaze lifting to Grant. The officer stiffens. He doesn't know who she just called, but something in her expression makes his stomach drop. The customers exchange glances, whispering. Who is Margaret's son? And what will he do when he arrives? Who is her son? And what will he do? Officer Grant crosses his arms, his smug expression returning. He still believes he's in control, despite the murmurs around him. Margaret shifts slightly, wincing from the pain in her shoulder, but her eyes remain steady, filled with something Grant doesn't quite understand, calm confidence. He snorts, shaking his head. "You should have just done what I said, lady," he mutters, his voice dripping with arrogance. A few customers gasp audibly. The store manager, a middle-aged man in a pressed button-down, steps forward. His expression is a mix of concern and panic. He leans toward Grant, lowering his voice. "You're in trouble," he warns. "You have no idea who she is." Grant raises an eyebrow, scoffing. "Who she is?" He lets out a short laugh. "She's just some old woman who thinks she's above the law." The manager swallows hard, shaking his head. "You need to step back before it's too late." Just then, the sound of screeching tires cuts through the tension. Everyone in the store turns toward the entrance. A sleek, black SUV pulls up sharply, its polished surface reflecting the bright lights from inside. The vehicle is massive, its tinted windows concealing whoever is inside. The automatic doors slide open, and heavy footsteps echo against the tile floor. A tall, broad-shouldered man steps out. He wears a sharp navy blue suit, crisp and spotless. His gold watch glints under the fluorescent lights. His presence radiates authority. The moment his face is visible, gasps ripple through the store. A woman near the registers whispers in disbelief, That's... Even the store manager takes a step back, eyes wide. Officer Grant frowns, suddenly uneasy. The man's piercing gaze locks onto him. Grant feels the weight of the entire room shift. The man's jaw tightens as he strides forward with calm but deadly precision. Margaret smiles softly. "There's my boy." Grant's blood runs cold. Who is this man, and why is everyone so afraid of him? Who is he, and why is everyone so shocked? A heavy silence fills the store as the tall man steps closer. Margaret's son is none other than District Attorney Jonathan Johnson, one of the most powerful legal figures in the city. The moment his name is whispered, a wave of shock washes over the room. Customers exchange wide-eyed glances. Even the store employees, who had been hesitant to intervene, now watch with bated breath. But no one is more stunned than Officer Grant. His once confident smirk disappears. His face pales as recognition dawns. Jonathan doesn't blink. His eyes burn into Grant's, a sharp contrast to the controlled, almost lethal calmness in his voice. "Did you just put your hands on my mother?" The words are slow, deliberate, yet they hit like a sledgehammer. Grant opens his mouth, but no sound comes out. Sweat gathers at his brow as he struggles to form a response. He knows exactly who Jonathan is, the DA who prosecutes dirty cops, the man who has ruined careers with a single case, the last person he ever wanted to cross. "Sir, I was just doing my job," Grant stammers, stepping back slightly. Jonathan doesn't move. His expression doesn't waver. "Your job?" he repeats, his voice low but dangerous. Grant nods quickly, scrambling for words. She was resisting. I was just trying to maintain order." Jonathan tilts his head slightly, as if considering the excuse. But his jaw tightens, his hands clenching at his sides. "You just assaulted a woman. My mother." The tension in the room thickens. "And I promise you." Jonathan takes one slow step forward. "You will pay for it." Grant swallows hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. This wasn't just a mistake. This was career-ending. What will Jonathan do next? Officer Grant stands frozen, his mind racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be in control. Jonathan Johnson, however, wasn't done yet. The tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. Customers and employees alike stood still, watching, waiting. Some were still recording. Others whispered among themselves. Jonathan's voice was sharp and commanding as he spoke into his phone. "Chief Reynolds, I expect you to handle this personally. Officer Grant is guilty of excessive force and abuse of power. I have multiple witnesses and video evidence. I want an internal investigation launched immediately, and I expect answers before the day is over." His words were measured, but the power behind them was undeniable. Grant couldn't believe what was happening. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Just moments ago, he had all the power. Now, it was slipping through his fingers like sand. "Sir." The store manager stepped forward nervously, clutching a stack of papers. His voice wavered slightly as he spoke. "We have security footage, multiple angles. It's all here." Jonathan turned to him, his sharp eyes softening slightly. "Thank you. I'll need a copy." The store manager nodded quickly, eager to comply. That was when something unexpected happened. One by one, customers started speaking up. "I saw it," an elderly man in a blue cap said, stepping forward boldly. "She wasn't doing anything wrong. That officer, he went after her for no reason." A young woman, still holding her phone, lifted it higher. "I recorded the whole thing," she said. "This is going online tonight." A teenager near the front of the line clenched his fists, shaking his head. "I've seen stuff like this before, but this time, people aren't looking away." Officer Grant's heart pounded. He could feel the walls closing in. This was bad. Really, really bad. Outside, the sound of sirens cut through the evening air, growing louder. The store windows reflected the flashing blue and red lights as 2 squad cars pulled up. Then, the doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. But this time, they weren't here to protect Grant. They were here for him. A senior officer, his badge glinting under the fluorescent store lights, locked eyes with Jonathan and gave a curt nod. "We've received orders to detain Officer Grant pending investigation." His voice was steady, but there was something else in his tone, something final. Officer Grant staggered back. Number. This wasn't happening. "This is a mistake," he sputtered. His face turned red, sweat beating at his temples. "I was doing my job. She was resisting." Jonathan took a step closer, his expression hard and unreadable. "You assaulted my mother, Officer Grant, in front of dozens of witnesses. On camera." His voice dropped lower. "Tell me, how exactly do you plan to talk your way out of this?" Officer Grant had no answer. One of the uniformed officers stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands behind your back." Grant's breath hitched. He had put countless people in cuffs before, but never in a million years did he think he'd be the one wearing them. "Wait. Just listen," he started, his voice rising in desperation. The senior officer wasn't having it. "You'll have your chance to explain," he said flatly, "but right now, you're coming with us." The second officer grabbed Grant's wrist, twisting it behind his back. For the first time in his life, Grant felt the cold metal snap shut around his wrists. A hush fell over the store. Then, a slow clap. A woman near the front of the crowd began clapping, shaking her head. Then another, and another, until the entire store was erupting in applause. Officer Grant's face burned. He felt humiliated, exposed. Jonathan didn't move. He simply watched as the man who had abused his power was finally held accountable. His mother, Margaret, still shaken but standing strong, reached out and squeezed his arm. Jonathan covered her hand with his. Justice was finally being served. Will Grant face real consequences, or will the system protect him? A week later, the world watched closely as Officer Grant stood trial for assault and misconduct. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and everyday citizens filled the seats, all eager to see if justice would truly be served. At the defense table, Officer Grant sat stiffly, wearing a suit instead of his uniform. His jaw was clenched, his fingers gripping the table edge so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Across from him, Jonathan Johnson sat calm and composed, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. His mother, Margaret, sat beside him, her head held high, despite everything she had endured. The trial began, and the prosecutor wasted no time. Your Honor, the evidence in this case is overwhelming, the prosecutor stated firmly. Not only do we have multiple eyewitness testimonies, but we also have clear video evidence of Officer Grant assaulting an innocent woman. The jury shifted uncomfortably as the footage was played on the large screen. The courtroom fell silent as the video played. On the screen, Officer Grant shoved Margaret without hesitation. Her body hit the floor. The gasps, the shock, the horrified looks on bystanders' faces. It was all there, undeniable. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Jonathan kept his gaze locked on Grant, watching as the former officer's face paled. Grant's lawyer stood. "Your Honor," he began, adjusting his tie nervously. "My client was simply trying to do his job. Mrs. Johnson was acting suspiciously." At those words, Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Before the judge could respond, Jonathan stood. The entire room turned to him. His voice was calm, but razor-sharp as he spoke. "What's suspicious about a woman trying to buy groceries?" The courtroom went silent. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "Mr. Johnson raises an important point," the judge said slowly, turning his attention back to Grant's lawyer. "Explain to me, what exactly did Mrs. Johnson do that warranted excessive force?" Grant's lawyer opened his mouth, then hesitated. He looked at Grant, who refused to meet his gaze. There was no excuse, no justification. The judge sighed, unimpressed. He turned back to the jury, nodding. "Let's proceed." The tension in the room thickened. What verdict will be reached? The courtroom was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Everyone's eyes were locked on the judge as he prepared to read the verdict. Officer Grant sat frozen, his breathing shallow, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Margaret held her son's hand tightly, but her face remained calm, unwavering. The judge cleared his throat, his voice echoing across the room. "In the case of Officer Grant versus the people, this court finds the defendant guilty of assault and abuse of power." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. A few people clapped quietly, while others simply nodded in silent approval. Grant's face went ghostly pale. His jaw trembled as he processed what had just happened. He turned to his lawyer, but the man simply looked away, as if defeated. The judge continued, his voice unwavering. "Officer Grant, due to the severity of your actions, you are hereby sentenced to 3 years in prison and are permanently banned from ever serving in law enforcement again." Margaret exhaled sharply, the weight of the past few days finally lifting off her shoulders. Jonathan turned to her, his expression softening. "It's over, Mom." Margaret looked up at her son, her eyes filled with both relief and wisdom. Justice was served. For a moment, the courtroom felt different, as if a wrong had finally been made right. But beyond this single case, the bigger question remained. How will this case change policing in the city? A month later, the impact of Margaret's case was bigger than anyone had expected. Margaret stood at a community event, surrounded by people from all walks of life. Some were young, some were old, but all were here for one reason: to stand against injustice. She gripped the microphone, her voice steady yet powerful. "This wasn't just about me," she began. "This was about all of us." The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding and clapping. Jonathan stood beside her, watching with pride as his mother's words moved the audience. He took a deep breath and made a major announcement. "Starting today, our office is implementing new policies to prevent racial profiling and excessive force." The crowd erupted into applause, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Margaret smiled proudly at her son. The video of her incident had gone viral, sparking national conversations on police reform. People everywhere were demanding change. Margaret turned back to the crowd, her eyes filled with determination. "If you see injustice, don't stay silent." She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. "Speak up. Fight back. Because one voice can start a movement." The audience stood up, clapping, cheering, and chanting for justice. This wasn't just a victory for Margaret. This was a message to the world, a reminder that no one is too small to make a difference. Change doesn't start in courtrooms. It starts in our communities. It starts with us,